Welcome to J-Cats, a program that seeks to introduce Japanese contextualized literature and ideas for use by missionaries and anyone that seeks to share the gospel with Japanese people.
日本人から聞く日本のキリスト教。
Hey everybody, welcome to J-Cats, Japanese Contextual and Theological Studies. 日本人から聞く日本のキリスト教 is how we're explaining what we're trying to do here. My name is John Robison. I'm a missionary to Japan. Came here as a missionary in 2007. Have spent time in Tokyo, Tohoku, and again back in Tokyo. But this podcast is not about me. It's about you. It's about missionaries, and it's for missionaries. And what missionaries are doing, what we want to see happen in Japan is the church grow. Japan is an interesting place because despite a lot of missionary efforts and resources, the population of Christians in Japan has mostly never been above about 1%, which estimates today put it at about 0.7% of the population. Now, there's been different reasons that people think why this might be. We're not going to try to 100% solve the problem right here, but a number of people think that poor contextualization efforts have contributed to the problem, or lack of contextualization efforts have contributed to not solving the problem, might be another way of putting it. There's different types of contextualization. I'm going to try to explain perhaps what we want to do on this podcast, and perhaps some of the things that we're going to try to do less of on this podcast. But also hopefully we can just have a good time. I don't know of any other podcasts for missionaries in Japan, and I know that there are thousands of us. I like listening to podcasts when I drive, or when I ride the train, or when I do the dishes. And if you're into podcasts, then hopefully you can add this one to your rotation. There's a YouTube video as well, which is just me doing this, or in the case that we have guests, then hopefully we can put that up on YouTube as well. But I'd like to go through a couple of quotes from books. Books about Japan, books by Japanese, books by missionaries or missiologists that talk about contextualization and what it is and why it's necessary. So my first quote that I want to go over here is actually not from a book. It's from the 9 Marks website. And it's called an article called "Putting Contextualization in Its Place." It says, "Everyone contextualizes. Every American Christian worships in a contextualized church. As much as we like to think of our churches as New Testament churches, there actually are no New Testament churches in existence today. Our cultural context is dramatically different from the world of the New Testament, and as a result, any modern church would look bizarre and alien to a first century Christian." I totally agree with that. I think one of the dangers around the contextualization issue for missionaries in Japan is to just ignore it. We can sometimes ignore that the churches that we came from are set within a cultural context. And so one danger is to bring a completely imported gospel message and imported materials and things like that. Maybe we translate them into Japanese, but we have no attempts to decontextualize issues that would be from our home culture, and then contextualize for the Japanese culture. That would be a danger, and I think something that as missionaries, as missionary organizations, as people trying to reach out cross-culturally, we should be careful about. I want to move on to another quote here. Let me just make sure I've got the right one. I want to quote from Mitsuo Fukuda, who wrote Developing a Contextualized Church as a Bridge to Christianity in Japan. And I'm going to show you the book for those of you who can see. I actually bought it in Japanese, then realized there's an English copy. Quickly read that on my Kindle. So I'm showing you the Japanese cover. And what's interesting about this is we have a large tree on the cover with deep roots. And in the shade of the large tree, we have a small tree inside a pot on top of those roots. And he's using that as sort of a metaphor, I guess, a picture of how he sees Christianity in Japan. So here is a quote, just the beginning of chapter 1 from his book. Even after more than 400 years of missionary effort in Japan, Christians still make up only 0.7% of the Japanese population. One of the major reasons for this lack of effectiveness is a lack of contextualization. Japanese Christianity is like a potted plant, which has been transported without having been transplanted. Japanese people see Christianity as a Western religion to which they cannot relate. Japan's intellectual, westernized Christianity is like a small, middle-class ghetto that is almost irrelevant to the reality of most people's lives. Okay? So he comes from a perspective that contextualization is very important. And I agree with him. Another quote that I'd like to read here is from the book Japanese Perspectives on the Death of Christ. This is by Dr. Hao Chuang Chua, who was a missionary with OMF. This book was published just a few years ago. Sadly, Dr. Chua passed away, I believe, just a bit before this book was actually published. Let's see. And this is at the beginning of that book. It says, there has been no lack of attempt on the part of missionaries, missiologists, and scholars of Japanese religion to offer reasons for the apparent lack of response to the gospel in Japan. And then he offers a bunch of citations. Studies can only uncover proximate causes for the situation at hand. Hence, it is not possible to attribute the problem to one particular reason. This notwithstanding, it is not unreasonable to surmise the general failure of church planters and evangelists to understand the complexities of Japanese culture and Japanese ways of thinking as a major cause for the slow growth of the Japanese church. 2 more citations. Many Japanese people continue to be put off by the foreign feel of Christianity. Even in my short time in Japan, not a few came confessing to me that they found the logic of the gospel as presented to them alien and difficult to grasp. Let's see. And then just below that, perhaps in their zeal to preserve the biblical integrity of the gospel, missionaries, notably evangelicals, have unwittingly sacrificed cultural intelligibility. In sum, it seems fair to say the missionaries in Japan have generally not done well in contextualizing the Christian message in its transmission. Okay, so not a ringing endorsement, but that's what this podcast is for. I want to, investigate these issues with you guys, and by listening to primarily Japanese pastors, scholars, academics, teachers, lay people even. I think there's probably a place for dialogue, but what I hope to do here has more to do with looking at literature put out in Japan or by Japanese, and hopefully as much as possible interviewing Japanese people with ideas on how this might work better. All right. Another quote that I wanted to read is from longtime missionary in Japan, John Main's new book, just released a few days ago. In that book, let me just see the Japanese. Oh, I dropped one of my devices. Japanese as an unreached people group. Literally was released like within the last week. So thank you, John, for your work. And here is a quote about contextualization. He says, if we walk alone on this journey of contextualization, we will walk into hazards. And then he says, we need a larger audience of participants that includes scholars and academics in cultural anthropology, sociology of religion and missiology, and practitioners in Japan, including workers, leaders, and pastors, especially those evangelicals who believe in the authority of Scripture. We need all of them to dialogue on these issues. We really cannot avoid contextualization. We either do it well or we do it poorly. And so we can see together here that the idea that contextualization is necessary for our work in Japan as missionaries, as well as just probably for the health of the church in Japan. One of the recurring themes here is that Christianity feels foreign to the everyday Japanese person. And again, in that book that I just looked at, John Main was advocating for, I suppose, something of like a think tank of people coming together and thinking through what contextualization is. Dr. Chua, when I say Dr. Chua and I say John Main, apologies, I'm pretty sure John Main is also a doctor. So, I want to try to recognize that as much as I can remember to. But Dr. Chua had the idea here of, in his book, of learning from Japanese scholars about Japan. So one of the things that this show, JCATS, Japanese Contextual and Theological Studies, is aiming at is Dr. Chua puts forth, I guess, contextualization as sort of looking at Japan as an object and thinking through how we can maybe change our approach as missionaries, and specifically mentions how missionaries maybe are seeing that Japan is perhaps more of a shame culture than a guilt culture. However, the second way to look at contextualization, according to Dr. Chua, would be to just simply listen to Japanese on how they are appropriating the gospel for their own culture. So that's kind of the route that I want to take. I want to look at resources and interview Japanese, again, scholars, academics, pastors, lay people. Here's a sample of the kinds of books that I'd like to look through together, and I'm kind of a nerd for some of this stuff. So my thought is that if you're not, you can just get the short version of a lot of this without going out and buying all the books and reading them all. I know that missionaries have a lot of stuff to do. We wear a lot of hats. Just learning Japanese is hard enough, right? Yeah, just learning Japanese is hard enough, but I think that the reality is that in order to do our job well, we do need to also become familiar as much as possible with some of these ideas. So, just a sample. Here's a book called 3 Mile an Hour God by Kosuke Koyama, a missionary from Japan. He's written a number of books, and I think there's a lot of great principles for missionaries in general, as well as for Westerners working in Asia and working in Japan specifically. So that's the type of resource I think that I'd like to look at. Here's another one, A History of Japanese Theology. Apologies to my YouTube guys because my light is shining all over that cover and it's difficult to read. Editor is Yasuo Furuya. And this is it's full of a very brief history of Japanese theologians, Protestant theologians, largely over the course, I guess, since, what would it be? Maybe the Meiji Revolution? Since Protestantism came to Japan after Commodore Perry and the Black Ships and all. Anyway, until around the time the book was written, I want to say in the late 90s, or was completed around the late 90s or around 2000. Knowing, I think, as missionaries, if we know some Japanese theologians and just what has been important to Japanese theologians in the past decade and a half, decade plus, century plus, not decade plus, then I think that'll help us to see the types of things that tend to connect well with Japan and tend to not connect well. Getting a little deeper here. This is Senkyo Gaku Readings, Nihon Bunka to Kiristokyō. That's Senkyo Gaku, missional readings, I guess. Missiology readings might be a translation for that, and Nihon Bunka, Japanese culture, to Kiristokyō, and Christianity. Okay, and what this is just a number of essays about contextualization in Japan. One of them that I looked through is the contextualized sermon. Now, how cool would that be? So many missionaries, myself included, preach sermons in Japan, in Japanese, and we do it as much as we can the way we might do it in the States, right? Or Canada, or wherever you're from. I'm from California, and so I'm going to default to U.S. culture as culture one for myself. I understand and appreciate that a lot of missionaries are not going to be from the West, and I think that's really good because personally I think something that missions in most non-Western countries in the world is going to have to grapple with is not just decontextualization, but what could be labeled decolonization, in the idea that there's a lot of baggage that has come to various parts of the world alongside missionary work, and that has been intertwined with missionary work. Perhaps less so in Japan than in other places, but it's still something to be mindful of. And there are still a lot of things that need to be disentangled. So, yeah, what should a contextualized Japanese sermon look like? That's a topic that I'm excited to go over from this reading in the future. One more sample here. Dendo. Evangelism. Yeah? Evangelism, ministry. Shinko seikatsu no tebiki, I think is what it says. Anyway, this is put out by Nihon Kiristo Kyodan Shuppan Kyoku. So this is the Kyodan's publisher. How do Japanese do evangelism? Okay? Or how are they taught to do evangelism? And that's something I think we can look through and see some principles for how we can reach the Japanese in a natural way. A lot more stuff. There's a lot of books that are written or translated into English by Japanese scholars. A lot of books that can be dug through to find some things that are not written in English, but hopefully we can still get some take the time to get some good stuff out of them and talk about them in this podcast. And again, looking forward to some interviews with some Japanese people in various parts of the Christian world that will be willing to offer some of their thoughts on how we can come to a better contextualized presentation of the gospel. So thank you so much for listening along on this first sort of opening episode of what I hope can be a journey towards a better contextualized gospel message, so that the church in Japan can grow, so that it can be more like a tree planted in soil rather than a tree sitting in a pot sitting on top of soil. So yeah, thanks a lot, and look forward to interacting some more in the future.